Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Innovation Showcase. The main purpose of this ongoing series is to inform viewers about exciting innovations and creative individuals across the fields of business, science, technology, education, and the arts. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Amanda Bellows. Amanda is a historian who teaches at the New School in New York City. She's also the author of the very engaging and informative book entitled The Explorers, A New History of America in 10 Expeditions. Recently published, The Explorers employs a novel approach recounting the history of America through the stories of 10 extraordinary adventurers, from Sacagewea to Sally Ride. During the program, we're finding out why and how the book came about, and in the process, come to better understand and appreciate these remarkable individuals and how their incredible wide range of explorations both inform and enrich our understanding of the history of America. Let's start by meeting Amanda and then hearing all about the Explorers, a new history of America in 10 expeditions. Welcome, Amanda. So delighted you're able to be here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here today.
The topic of exploration and explorers has long been of interest. So I was very excited to find out about your book, learned so much from reading it, have a lot more to still follow up and eager to hear about that soon and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, I think it would also be of interest if you just briefly share maybe a little bit more about your background, academic interests, current position, please.
Sure. Well, I'm from New York City, and I received my PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And then I went back to New York, and I've been teaching there at the New School, which is a university. I teach undergraduates history, and my research specialties are 19th and 20th century US history. And I also have a background in Russian history. My first book was a comparison of American slavery and Russian serfdom.
Very interesting. What was the inspiration, motivation for the explorers?
Yes. Well, I think the topic of exploration is very exciting. And I think discoveries have really shaped the development of our nation historically. But when I started researching this book and thinking about who the most famous American explorers were, figures like Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Kit Carson, Jim Bowie came to mind. And I wondered, all of these people are men from a particular demographic operating on the Western frontier in the mid 19th century. And I wanted to know, were there people that had been left out of the story of American exploration? So I did some more research and some traveling, and I came up with the historical figures that you will see in this book. 10 men and women from diverse backgrounds whose discoveries all shaped the development of the United States over the course of 200 years.
And how did you go about initially and maybe how it developed, just the conceptualization for the book, like
Yes.
what you were trying to get across?
Yes. So the book has 10 chapters, and each chapter features a particular explorer. And so that explorer also kind of represents what was happening during a particular moment in US history. So the book begins in 1776 with the American Revolution, and we quickly dive into the mission of the Corps of Discovery. So that mission, right, intended to find out what was out there in the Louisiana Purchase territory and beyond to see if there was a Northwest Passage to the Pacific Ocean. And so that chapter, the first chapter, is told from the perspective of Sacagewea, whose story is sometimes lost to that of Lewis and Clark in the telling of the Corps of Discovery's mission. And the 9 chapters after that take us through all different eras of American history. We go through the Gold Rush, the Homestead
Mm.
Act era, the conservation era, where we see the objectives of explorers changing from the acquisition of land to the preservation of land. Now, the first 5 chapters comprise part one, and the 5 individuals featured in part one are exploring within the bounds of the continental United States, or what would become that. The second part of the book looks at the lives of five explorers who are traveling beyond the United States after the closing of the so-called frontier in 1890. And so it's five men and women who are going to the North Pole, going all throughout South America. And the last two chapters treat air and space as new frontiers, looking at the lives of Amelia Earhart and other aviators, and Sally Ride and other astronauts.
Of the wide range of individuals you could choose from, how did you go about narrowing it down to the 10 that we'll hear a little bit about shortly?
That's a great question. Well, I wanted to pick a mix of familiar and unfamiliar names. And even some of the familiar names that you might recognize in the book, someone like Amelia Earhart, for instance, or John Muir or Laura Ingalls Wilder, perhaps readers won't have thought of them as typical American explorers. So that was one basis. And then I just wanted to have a great mix of people and again, have each person represent a particular moment in history. And so that really helped me narrow down which person would be appropriate for each part of the story.
Mhm. Well, going back to the beginning in Sacagewea, who you said, and I think is rightly so, many of us have some understanding of her. Could you share maybe just one or two brief misinformation we might not know about her that
Absolutely.
we construe? Yeah.
Yes. So she's a fascinating individual. She had an extremely difficult life. And most of the information that we know about her comes from the journals of Lewis and Clark.
Mm.
There are also oral traditions among indigenous nations about her history. And there's still some debate about different aspects of her life. For instance, where she died and when she died, and so forth. Um, but maybe readers don't know that she was kidnapped. So she was born in present day Idaho as a member of the Shoshone people, and she was kidnapped by members of the Hidatsa Nation one summer at the age of about 12. And she was captured and taken all the way to present day North Dakota. Eventually, she was forced into marriage to the French Canadian trapper Toussaint Charbonneau, and she was living with him and pregnant with his child when the Corps of Discovery came to that region of North Dakota. And then Charbonneau negotiated his role as an interpreter for the Corps of Discovery, and Sacagewea was one of two of his wives. And for reasons lost to history, we don't know why she versus the other wife, Otter Woman, went on the trip. But that trip was really life-changing for her because for the Corps of Discovery, it was a trip into the unknown. But for Sacagewea, it was a chance to return to her homeland in the West.
You know, if I had to rank order who I would think are the top explorers of the ones you selected, I would definitely have her at the top of the list, one, two, or something, just because of the impact, as you said,
Yeah.
the court discovery made in our country's development.
Absolutely. Some of the major consequences of that mission were, of course, discovering that no water route existed, no simple water route from east to west.
Mm.
But the Corps of Discovery also discovered, they were writing down the things that they saw along the way. And so they found evidence of new animals and plants and animals that were new to science, let's put it that way. They wrote down a lot of information about the different indigenous peoples that they met along the journey, which is a remarkable snapshot of what early America was like and how what the cultures of those different peoples were at that time. And yeah, it was really a remarkable journey that brought a lot of information back to people living in the East.
Well, the next person that you highlight is one of several that I am probably many people are not that familiar with, in my case at all, James Beckworth. Just for the sake of time, one or two quick points that stand out that you think viewers should know about Mr. Beckworth.
Yes. James Beckworth was an African American mountain man. He was born into slavery in Virginia, and he basically found a new life for himself on the Western frontier. He was extremely entrepreneurial, creative, and he assimilated into different communities and different parts of the West. For instance, he lived among the Crow Nation, members of the Crow Nation for a period of time, claimed that he rose to the level of chief. He lived in the Southwest. He just happened to be in California when the gold rush began. And so, like so many other people, the chapter deals with the gold rush and talks about all the people flocking to California at that remarkable period in history. And Beckworth saw all these people who were trying to strike it rich, prospecting for gold, but he thought to himself, gosh, maybe I'll make more money by selling goods to prospectors, as a businessman, instead of digging for gold, panning for gold. So
Terrific.
he does that. And then he's also most well known for having discovered the lowest pass through the Sierra Nevada
Mm.
mountain range. And so he makes that pass into a road, and that facilitates the emigration from east
Terrific.
to
Well,
west.
that's a great summary, but so much more to find out about him in the chapter. Now, the next person who you mentioned earlier might not come to mind. At least she didn't for me, Laura Ingalls Wilder as explorer per se. Um, you're thinking of including her, please.
Yes. So Laura Ingalls Wilder, I think many people have read the Little House stories, and those are written for children, of course. And in recent years, her own autobiographical manuscript has been published, which sheds light on just how difficult her journey was and her life was. So she migrated to Dakota Territory, what was then Dakota Territory, what is today present day South Dakota, with her family. Um, and they established a homestead there. She later married Almanzo Wilder, and they established their own homestead. And so, I try to highlight in the chapter the parts of her life that are lesser known, and also kind of shed light on, well, I chose her because I wanted her to represent the many other female homesteaders whose experiences have been lost to history because they didn't record those experiences, and to challenge readers to think, and people might agree or disagree, to what extent were pioneers or homesteaders explorers. So I leave that to readers to decide. But I hope her story helps people think about that era in a new way. And then also, I want to make sure that readers know that the story of the impact of settlement on the indigenous peoples living in Dakota Territory are highlighted, because settlement was so disruptive, not only in this chapter, but in other chapters. We see how exploration can lead to settlement, and often does, which leads to the acquisition of land, the exploitation of resources, and for indigenous people, oftentimes violent displacement from their land, being forced onto reservations, the destruction of the environment, and also the spread of deadly diseases. So all of these stories are a part of the book, and I think it's important to have a full and honest picture of exploration.
Still sticking into the United States before moving on, you
Yes.
touch on a well-known preservationist, John Muir. Given all you probably knew about him before, what's one or two things that surprised you or that you learned that you just had no idea about him that are worth sharing?
Sure. So I think people know John Muir well. He helped found Yosemite National Park and other national parks afterward, in the wake of that important moment in US history. But I never thought completely about how his status as a Scottish immigrant might have affected his perspective of the American wilderness. Um, I think maybe some Americans didn't appreciate wild places, natural landscapes. They would look at a forest and say, well, here's timber and we can cut these trees down and use this. And Muir came from Scotland, which, had been settled And, for instance, logging in Scotland, right? There aren't many trees in Scotland, and so much of it was cut down long before John Muir was even born. So John Muir comes to America as an 11-year-old. He moves to the Wisconsin wilderness. And I think throughout the course of his life, having come from somewhere else gave him that new perspective and probably influenced his love of the environment and passion for the idea of conservation.
The next person, somebody I wasn't familiar with. So glad you included her. And if you could share just a word or two about Florence Merriam Bailey.
Yes, so she is the subject of the fifth chapter of the book. And like Muir, her life kind of represents this shift in the objectives of explorers from, again, that acquisition of land to the preservation of land. Now, while Muir is focused on conservation of land, um, Florence Merriam Bailey was focused on the preservation of wildlife, in particular birds. So she grew up during the Gilded Age. She lived on the East Coast in New York, where fashion was very important, and women were putting feathers and even whole bodies of birds into their hats and feathers in their clothing and that sort of thing. Also, hunting as a pastime of the Gilded Age elite was growing in popularity. So these factors together were leading to this ecological crisis where bird populations were rapidly dwindling. And Florence Marion Bailey went exploring in different parts of the West, and then came back and wrote down what she learned about and what she saw about bird populations there as a way of gathering support among people and changing their perspectives about birds as a type of creature to be preserved and not slaughtered for fashion or for sport.
Mhm. And the next individual who's going to take us into the second part of the book, sort of the next theme per se, is an individual who I'd put right up there, maybe one, two, with Sacagewea
Yeah.
as impact, true explorer who made, I mean, everybody here made a difference, but in so many meaningful ways, somebody wasn't familiar with it all. Again, thank you for including William Shepard and just a thumbnail sketch of this remarkable individual, please.
Yes, William Shepard was an incredible man. He was an African American man born in Virginia, and he became the first African American missionary to go to what was then the Belgian Congo. So this is the era of imperialism, and his story doesn't really fit the mold completely. So that's what makes, I think that's one of the things that makes it an interesting chapter to read. How is he perceived among the Congolese people being African American, but also bringing, Christianity to that region. And what's remarkable about Shepard's story is that while he's in the Congo, he basically helps uncover and expose the atrocities that King Leopold II of Belgium were perpetuating against the Congolese people. So he risks his own life to uncover the terrible doings. And then he writes a report that helps generate international outrage and generates pressure against the king to, you know, change his ways and withdraw, let go of his hold on the Congo.
Mhm. And the next two individuals may be the two most courageous that you've included. The first one, Harriet Chalmers Adams, somebody again was totally new to me and found her incredibly fascinating. So gutsy and just out there, a true adventurer.
Yes, Harriet Chalmers Adams was a remarkable a woman and an explorer who, broke the social boundaries of her day to explore, I believe, every country in South America around 1904, 1905. So she climbed, the highest volcanoes and went into the deepest jungles. And she was not exploring again for the acquisition of land. She wanted geographic information, and she wanted to also record her observations of the different indigenous peoples that she met in South America. So, what did she do with what she found? She gave her pictures and wrote stories for National Geographic magazine as one of their first female contributors. And would you like me to touch on Matthew Henson as well?
Yes, please. The next one I wanted to get at Matthew Henson, somebody we might be a little more familiar with, I think, but you provided some very helpful, informative background information that, again, wasn't familiar with. And again, a good example, as are several others, of individuals for various reasons who were
Yeah.
not given the proper credit they
Yes.
were due at that time and still to this day to some degree.
Yes. So this chapter about Matthew Henson is my favorite chapter in the book. And it's about the race to the North Pole. So there was an international competition to see which country's explorers could be the first to reach the North Pole. And there was a man named Robert Peary, who was the commander of the expedition. Well, there were, multiple expeditions kind of pushing further and further north in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And Matthew Henson and Robert Peary were, teamed up in this competition. Now, Robert Peary was white and Matthew Henson was African American, and they're operating in the Jim Crow era. So Matthew Henson had to overcome many obstacles to get where he was, but he was an absolutely integral part of the expedition, and there's no way they would have succeeded without him. He was fluent in the Inuit language. He knew how to build dog sleds. He was an expert dog sledder. And he was likely the first person to actually reach the North Pole, or as close as they could have gotten using the instruments
Mm.
of the day. But so after Peary and Henson and the four Inuit men on their journey went to the North Pole and came back, Robert Peary, being the head of the expedition and being white, received basically all of the credit for that milestone. And only it was only in African American owned newspapers that Henson's skills were touted and that he was praised for his impressive accomplishment. So he faced a lot of discrimination in his day, and it only wasn't until recent decades that his story has really been told to its fullest extent.
Yeah, oh, and thank you for adding even more to it. The book ends with two women explorers who are sort of at different ends of the continuum in the aviation industry.
Yes.
Um, Again, people were somewhat familiar, maybe even very familiar with. So, just one or two words about each of them, Amelia Earhart and then Sally Ride, please.
Yes, I think these names are more familiar to readers, but I think what these chapters do is help us think about air as a new frontier and space as a new frontier. And this might be a good moment to bring in the role of technology throughout history, and I think especially in the 20th century. New technologies to transport people have made it possible to reach new frontiers faster and than ever before, and taking people further. So, new advances in aviation enabled a female aviator like Amelia Earhart to have many accomplishments, one of which was her nonstop transatlantic solo flight across the ocean. In 1932. And then she also was trying to circumnavigate the world when she perished in 1937. And then you have World War II, and you have the invention and the harnessing of rocket power. And so that, of course, kicks off the space race in the 50s and 60s. And we have the moon landing in 1969. But the 10th chapter focuses on Sally Ride and the creation of the space shuttle system. Sally Ride went on the Challenger as the first American female astronaut in 1983. So all of those exciting milestones are covered in the last two chapters of the book.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I know you could have, and it must have been difficult to narrow it down to these 10 individuals. So perhaps if you had room for two or three more, who would you have wanted to include?
Yes, well, there were two people that were originally on the list and they were swapped out. And I think those were good decisions. But um, Nellie Bly, also known as Elizabeth Cochrane, the Progressive Era journalist who went around the world in a race inspired by Jules Verne's book. I replaced her story with that of William Shepard when I first heard about William Shepard midway through writing the book. And I just thought his story was so remarkable and important that it had to be included. So
Yeah.
unfortunately, Nellie Bly was out. And then the chapter on Sally Ride, I had originally considered focusing on Neil Armstrong instead and focusing on the moon landing as a milestone instead of what was happening with the space shuttle. But so many people are familiar with the moon landing story and Neil Armstrong's remarkable accomplishments that I decided to substitute that story for Sally Ride and do something a little lesser known instead.
What do you hope readers appreciate the most or come away with from reading your book?
Yes. I really hope that readers come away from the book inspired by the stories of these diverse men and women from all different backgrounds. And I hope that readers are inspired to go out and explore, defining that term broadly, explore their own world and discover new things in whatever their careers are.
And some final thoughts about just the future, perhaps, of America exploration.
Yes, this book really only scratches the surface of exploration. And so much has been done, even in the years, of course, since Sally Ride was on the space shuttle. I think there are well, in the epilogue of the book, I kind of touch on what the most exciting areas of exploration are today. I think deep ocean exploration is very important. Of course, something like a mission to Mars, NASA's planning to return to the moon to do new types of exploration there. And I thought, it was interesting to think about even something like the James Webb Telescope, which I'm sure people
Mm.
all know about, looking backward and learning about the past through these new technologies just are making me and many other people, right, think about exploration in broader terms than ever before. So there's still so much to discover about our world and our universe.
Most surely. In closing, how can viewers and others find out more about the book, your work, possibly contact you?
Sure. Well, I have a professional website, which is amanda-bellows.com, and that has upcoming events. I'm currently on a book tour. We'll be heading to the South soon and all across the West. I'll be at the National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. in mid-August. And I also have a professional Instagram account, which is at Amanda Bellows Historian. And you can see some great archival footage and some more information about the explorers and travels and that sort of thing if you're interested there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. As I mentioned, unfortunately, Amanda, we're at the end of the program. I want to thank you so much again for taking the time to be here. Again, learned so much, eager to follow up on some of the individuals that were brand new to me, and definitely recommend viewers and others pick up a copy of The Explorers, A New History of America in 10 Expeditions. Continued success with future endeavors.
Thank you so much for having me.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.